My name is Chloe Marie, and welcome to my presentation on Indigenous education from pre-contact to today. And so this is a presentation I made for a class that I'm currently a part of, Indigenous Children and Families. Let's get into it. My name is Chloe Marie. I am a fourth-year student of Law and Society, studying a minor of Indigenous Studies and Human Rights and Human Diversity. I took this class because even though I've been pursuing Indigenous Studies for a couple years, I'm still learning new things all the time. This class has been a great opportunity to expand my knowledge about pre-contact Indigenous culture and traditional practices. I identify as Caucasian, having Irish and Dutch confirmed on my biological father's side. I was born in Chatham, Kent, and I've always lived in Ontario, Canada, particularly the most southern regions, although I am definitely a settler. I do like to be part of the group of people that like to reclaim the word settler as a word that doesn't have negative connotations. Rather, it has responsibilities. Our understanding of Indigenous education has drastically shifted in the past decades. Residential schools that were once highly regarded as a common practice are now publicly condemned, and rightfully so. In this time of transition, we really have to consider what role should schools play to Indigenous children. I would like to talk about and contrast the similarities and differences between pre-contact and after-contact education. This gives us a great opportunity to showcase what used to be, what was, and maybe what could be in the future. We're talking about education before colonization. And so a lot of that teaching actually happened in the community and was undertaken by community members. Anybody could be a teacher. It was often very contextually dependent. Instead, today we have a curriculum where specific goals are imposed at specific ages, and so many people played a role in educating children. Quote, "It is underpinned by the key principle. Education is about raising healthy, rooted, contributing members of a community and should include spiritual, mental, physical, social, and emotional development." Quote, "A Frame for Decolonial Education, 2004. And so what we see is that a lot of Indigenous education before colonization was context dependent, meaning that children were taught things that they needed to know, that were practical, that applied to present or future situations. Whereas today we see many students of high school and elementary school learning things that perhaps are not practical. We often hear the commentary of, we should have learned how to do taxes in high school, but rather our career and civics classes is more focused on the abstract and fluctuating concept of economics and which career to choose. In terms of Indigenous education, learning was often tactile. People learned by being shown how to do such things. It was very application-based. In a practical sense, this is often how we learn, is when we're confronted with situations where we have to act. And in a lot of Indigenous education, there was this focus on getting advice and learning from other people. There was also a focus on playing games and learning through other mediums, such as storytelling, oral tradition, and activities. In Indigenous education, elders are a very important form of teacher. They possess sacred knowledge. They're not just people who are old, but instead elders are people with connections, gifts. They have experienced life and have obtained wisdom from it. And so taking this idea of pre-contact education, we can contrast it to what we see in elementary and high schools today across Canada. Instead of people and teachers being from the community, teachers instead are hired based on qualifications. And those qualifications are not particularly reflective of knowledge. They're reflective of perhaps privilege and access to teachers' college. And so in that way, knowledge is restricted. In post-contact education, residential schools were operated by churches. Many students were taught by religious people, priests, and nuns. Even today, but especially back then, this led to a power dynamic where learning is no longer context-dependent. It's imposed by a curriculum. It's structured by teachers or the government, not by what a community says should be learned. This power dynamic was often enforced, and children would be punished for speaking their native languages, and sometimes they were punished just for existing. Residential schools were not really designed to teach. They were designed to undo all of the education that had been done by Indigenous communities. Children weren't just being taught English. They were being forced to unlearn their native languages. It's important to understand this colonial violence. Let's talk about why we're here. There's a lot of direct disparities in Indigenous education. And so let's start off with this quote. As a result, Indigenous students in Quebec have the highest dropout rates compared to those elsewhere in Canada. As of 2021, about 31% of Indigenous people studying in Quebec don't have a diploma or certificate, compared to about 19% of the rest of Canada. Erica Morris, CTV News, reporter, 2024. And so that article that we just addressed is actually about a recent report from the Auditor General, which found that the Quebec's education ministry needs to do more for Indigenous students. Right now, the school system in Quebec has French as a primary language, and recently has capped the amount of students able to study English at 17.5%. The Auditor General's report included integrating Indigenous realities into curriculums, evaluating funding methods, and training staff to avoid prejudice. Looking more at the broader picture across Canada, overall, 63% of Indigenous youth have completed high school, compared to the 91% of non-Indigenous youth. And so we see a direct disparity here, where Indigenous children and youth are not having the same access to education as others. There have been a variety of studies recently undertaken to explore this phenomena, and what they found is Indigenous people are twice less likely to get a post-secondary education. Another interesting thing that researchers have found is that when they raise the age of considering these statistics of post-secondary diplomas achieved, when they raise the age from 30s and 40s, Indigenous people's education rates went slightly up. And so what they found was that older people are able to get their high school done. Maybe more studies should include this higher age range of when Indigenous people pursue education. So when we look at exclusively youth, we might see that some people are not getting their high schools. And then when we expand those statistics to include older ages, we see that people are doing their high schools. It's just at different points in their life. Okay, so now we're going to talk about a survival story from an Indigenous residential school survivor. His name is Walter West of the Talca First Nation, and he attended the Lejac Residential School in 1960. And so I wrote a discussion post on his experiences after watching his story. And so, with Walter's story in mind going forward, I'd like you to consider the question, would you step foot in the school again if you'd been through this? Walter was taken to a residential school at a young age. One of his biggest issues, he cites, is not being able to see his sister, despite her attending the same institution. There was a strict separation between males and females. Walter wasn't able to go home for the holidays, and when he received cards from his parents, they were pre-opened. Walter was suspicious that staff was opening his cards and perhaps removing the money. He was disconnected from his family and community, living in the residential school, not being able to see his sister, not being able to see his parents regularly, or other people that could be important to him. He was forced to adhere to strict routines. They were woken up early in the morning. A lot of the routines sounded very similar to military practices. They were woken up by a fire alarm, and most of the day would be spent doing laborious chores under the instruction of teachers. When he wasn't under the instruction of teachers, he often found himself the victim of bullying. Recess was not a safe space for him, as he was often fending for himself. Walter left the residential school 1 year after. I think it's very interesting that Walter's parents listened to him when he talked about how awful it was. They respected his wishes not to go back. Today, Walter runs his own business. He does experience challenges, and he is often pressured to get his high school diploma. But he has not stepped a foot in a school since his experiences in LeJac Residential School. This interview with the Legacy of Hope Foundation is the first time Walter has opened up about his story. And so, now we will go into the next section of our presentation of explaining why the current Ontario curriculum and Canadian curriculum harms Indigenous people. Currently in Ontario, they are adjusting the curriculum to discuss Indigenous issues starting from the grades of 1 to 3. Young children will be exposed to these materials. While the topic is definitely heavy for all students, Indigenous students could be particularly impacted because of how this content is related to their lives. Canadian curriculums currently are grounded in their own narratives and perspectives, which is that of the colonizer or settler. Indigenous history often goes back quite further than that, from the creation story to the Great Law of Peace. While these could be considered advanced Indigenous studies to the Canadian curriculum, they would be considered and are considered foundational knowledge for Indigenous peoples' recounting of history. And so, to further explain why the current curriculum could harm Indigenous people, we are going to look to an article by Terry Witherspoon, Seeking Reform of Indigenous Education in Canada, Democratic Progress or Democratic Colonialism. Taking a quote from the article to start us off, democratic principles devoted to fostering equality in a pluralist society coexist with practices and discourses that perpetrate racism and exclusion of Indigenous peoples and of other racial minorities. The entire human rights system is supposed to guarantee human rights. However, Indigenous peoples are known to experience discrimination in the legal system. Canadian human rights courts and documents don't always account for the fact that Indigenous rights need to be expressed differently than Canadian rights, like the right to self-government, the right to hunt, and the right to their lands and natural resources. Another way of thinking about democratic colonialism is when a system that includes and supports Indigenous people also treats them like an outsider and forces them to adhere to a group's norms. Similarly, as much as Ontario is committing to teaching about Indigenous history, we have to consider whether the actual Ontario legal system supports Indigenous rights. Or is this just mouth service to a cause? And so adding additional Indigenous education to Ontario curriculums on its face is a good thing. However, in many ways, the education system does not support Indigenous children equally, let alone with equity. Teaching more Indigenous history in a curriculum might benefit Indigenous people at large, but it could also harm the Indigenous children directly in that classroom. If we take the idea of democratic colonialism even further, it represents a kind of symbolic violence, where we force Indigenous people to adhere to a system that they are disadvantaged in. Quoting from the article, democratic colonial practices reinforce notions that Indigenous and national identities and rights are compatible with one another, in contrast to conceptions of justice that foster complementarily between capacities for self-determination among Indigenous people. Emerging from this idea of democratic colonialism, we see a need for a separate way for Indigenous people to obtain education, one that is not combined with the education the settler receives. And so, I would like to turn to some examples of what Indigenous education currently looks like in the Six Nations community along the Grand River Haldimand Tract. These are some amazing examples, some given and pointed to by my professor, Jessica Bomberry. I had the pleasure of taking her Indigenous Languages of Turtle Island class this year. The first place we're going to discuss is Kaweni Iyo / Gaweni Iyo, Mohawk and Cayuga. This is an amazing educational institute located on Six Nations. They offer Cayuga and Mohawk immersion for primary and secondary school students. The name translates to good words in Mohawk, Kaweni Iyo, and also good words in Cayuga, Gaweni Iyo. And so this institution is dedicated to providing immersion language programming. A quote from Jessica Bomberry during her teachings: "This education institution teaches Haudenosaunee kids how to be Haudenosaunee. They are taught their culture and their language in an environment closely connected to their cultural values of the Haudenosaunee." Jessica Bomberry, 2024. This institution was started in 1986. In a little garage, the group would go from place to place and study and learn language wherever they could. Since their establishment then, they have raised $3 million from private donors and continue to expand. In a CBC article published in December 23rd of 2021, staff at the school said that they made less than teachers on average in Ontario. In addition, they stated that there are many issues with the building, which had been retrofitted into a school. There's concrete floors, windowless rooms, and poor air circulation. They've made the best of a rough situation. Multiple times, they've submitted requests for funding to the appropriate agencies, asking for an estimated $15 million to $20 million to build a proper school. Indigenous Services of Canada have received these requests. However, the organization Indigenous Services of Canada have stated that they administer funding in a priority order according to health and safety, overcrowding, access to other educational facilities, and design requirements. These factors have given Indigenous Services a lot of power to determine what is considered a priority. As a result, this school has not been given funding. Worse yet, there's already many other Indigenous services that are awaiting funding as well. Turning to another example of local Indigenous education in the Six Nations community, Skrawron Hiase Kwaya, Everlasting Tree School, Mohawk Immersion, is another local organization dedicated to teaching immersion Indigenous languages. It was started in 2010 as a group of homeschooling families. They used the Waldorf curriculum because of its similarities to Indigenous education, letting the child progress at their own pace. This article from the Two Row Times explains that both follow a child's natural growth progression. The Waldorf method teaches adults to focus on a child's teeth to indicate it's time to start schooling. Similarly, but not the same, the Haudenosaunee tradition says to look at the hardening of the fontanelle, the soft spot on the child's head, both occurring around the age 7, for when to start educating children. Both of these examples reveal some common challenges that are encountered when starting Indigenous education institutions. They're very community-based solutions. There's a lot of self-determination involved, a willpower to start these programs with whatever resources are available, starting in garages and being very community-based. And because of that, there's a lot of power to choose the content and location. But it takes a lot of time and energy and a lot of people to create these programs. These programs are heavily dependent on community solidarity. People can show their solidarity by giving their time and money to these programs. Also, importantly, people in the community can appreciate and utilize these resources. Another way to show solidarity is to support the people who dedicate so much time and energy to these causes. Burnout is a common issue among people fighting for change. Despite all these challenges, there are solutions, and there are people fighting really hard for these causes. Right now, the Near North District School Board is launching a new online Ojibwe language program. Dedicated teacher Falcon McLeod has been working on an e-learning curriculum for many years. This e-learning curriculum will be offered to 56 school boards across Ontario, and students will have the opportunity to learn upper-level Indigenous language and to learn credits for upper Indigenous language. Previously, these courses were only offered in person. These courses will be welcoming for all levels of learners and will give an opportunity for Indigenous students and non-Indigenous students to learn more and get involved. Overall, there is a lot of challenges ahead to delivering Indigenous education. Another thing that must be noted is that smaller communities have less people and therefore have less abilities to seize this self-determination and seize resources to formulate their own Indigenous education. It's amazing that the power of people can make up for the lack of government funding. Creating and facilitating these programs, though, can take a toll on people's mental health and well-being. Studies about Indigenous education are too narrowly focused. Indigenous people engage in lifelong learning, and studies need to reflect this. The creation of Indigenous education programs illustrates that the Ontario curriculum is not sufficient and that other ways need to be explored. Another positive impact is generational healing. And while there have been limited studies on the concept, I want to believe if there is generational trauma, perhaps there can be generational healing. And that over time, we can normalize safety and peaceful relations with Indigenous people in Canada. Conversations around Indigenous education are very important to Indigenous families and children. Children are developing and growing, and they're trying to find their place in the world. It is very important that they have access and safe places to learn and embrace their traditional cultural practices. Indigenous families should have the opportunity to give their children Indigenous education without having to go into their pockets. While there are Indigenous education programs, a lot of them cost money, and they are not necessarily accessible to every person. The lack of programs that are government funded and available, and the underfunding of present programs, results in parents having to be their child's main cultural educator. And while in a pre-contact education society this could be reasonable, these Indigenous parents are subject to capitalism, where they have to work. They are not necessarily able to have the energy to be their child's primary educator. This cultural education at home is undermined by the opposite values imposed by mainstream education. So even if they are being taught Indigenous language and values at home, when they go to school, if it is a mainstream Ontario curriculum school or Canadian curriculum school, they will be experiencing and exposed to the opposite of the values they're taught at home, or very differing values, further complicating any efforts undergone by parents to teach them. And so, wrapping up our presentation now, I'd like to expand the applicability of this presentation to the law and life in general. We covered a bunch of different systemic issues, but we also covered systemic solutions and how advocating for funding is necessary and a continued struggle that needs to go on. Education and information offered in this presentation can also help to support clients. By learning about democratic colonialism, we get an insider perspective of how settler practices can impact Indigenous people differently than non-Indigenous people. We are prompted to offer different alternative resources to people that might be impacted by the information that we give them differently. Thank you for watching my presentation about Indigenous education. I hope you've taken one or two things from it. Let me know. Have a good night.